I'm proud to have Dr. Peter Attia, the founder of the Nutrition Science Initiative here at MBG for our speaker series, a man who has been described from some of our uh, medical snobs as a powerhouse in the field of nutrition. So it's an honor to have you here. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me. I don't know that I'd agree with that assessment, but
Okay. Well, we'll
I
go
could say worse things about you.
We'll go from being described as a powerhouse to the first part of your personal story where you swam from LA to the Catalina Island and your wife called you something which led to a whole journey.
Yeah, I'd been a marathon swimmer and had done a lot of these sort of fun long swims, and um, obviously you have to train a lot to do that, and probably averaged about 28, 30 hours a week of swimming plus weight training, and thought I was sort of following the iconic diet, food pyramid. And so, yes, on that particular day, which was September 8th, 2009, she said to me, a few minutes after I got out of the water, you need to be a little less, not thin. And
There's a word for that.
yeah, there is. She didn't use. Um, and that sort of, in many ways, I think kind of reset, although I didn't know it at the time, that discussion and the decisions I made in the following weeks and months, I think has sort of reset the direction of my life a little bit.
So where were you in terms of your weight back on September 8th, 2009, and where are you today? And also talk about body fat, everything. Where were you?
Yeah, so my weight back then sort of hovered between probably 205 and 210 with a body composition by DEXA in sort of the 20 to 25% range. Um, and but the thing I didn't realize at the moment that we had that discussion on the boat, on the Outrider, which was the name of the boat, I still remember, was that I was also pre-diabetic.
Hmm.
So that was, I think, that's why I said, sort of really what happened in the next couple of weeks that was, I think it was just sort of I just couldn't believe it, right? Like since I'd been 13 years old, I'd been like an extreme athlete. I just never imagined anything could happen. Those things that we talk about, diabetes, heart disease, that's for other people.
Right.
That certainly isn't for me.
What was your diet like?
So it was relatively low in fat and very high in carbohydrate because, of course, when you're exercising so much, at least at the time, I believed I needed so much carbohydrate to replenish glycogen. So my diet at the time was probably about 60 to 65% carbohydrate, which is higher than what, at least if you believe NHANES or the USDA would have you believe. The average American today, I guess, according to the best available evidence we would have, is probably about 50%, 50 to 55% carbohydrate with uh, depends on the data source, probably somewhere between 14 to 18% of that being an added sugar. I would say I was probably about 60, 65% carbohydrate with probably about 10% added sugar, maybe 15 just because of all the sports drinks. I would mainline these sports drinks, of course. And by the as we got later into the fall of that year was when I sort of said, okay, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't actually know what I should do. Maybe the answer isn't swimming 5 hours a day instead of 4 hours a day. Maybe I should tweak my diet.
And so what's your diet like today?
Well, I hate talking about my diet because I'm a self experimenter, right?
Sure.
And so I will say this, that over the period of 7 years, including a little bit before 2009, I think I've on myself with a reasonable level of rigor, experimented with everything from, you know, not raw veganism, but veganism all the way through to nutritional ketosis,
Right.
because those are about as far extremes as you can
Right.
get, with everything in between. What I happen to do today is very different. I am a big proponent of intermittent fasting. So
Hmm.
these days, I just eat one meal a day. So I
Alrighty.
basically go 23 hours without food, and then I eat dinner, and then 23 hours without food, and then I eat dinner.
So what's dinner for you then?
Um, well, it's kind of interesting. It's throughout this journey, I've realized that I'm actually personally very carbohydrate insensitive. I have to be very conscious of the dose. I think of these things as like, everything you eat is basically a drug, right? I mean, it's all
Right.
it's all basically molecules, right? So there's a dose effect. And with the 23 hours of fasting, it seems I can tolerate a much higher dose of carbohydrates. So, for example, once I sort of lost all the weight, resolved all the insulin resistance and those things, maintaining that required a relative abstinence from carbohydrates outside of vegetables. So I could still eat vegetables relatively easily, but I couldn't have rice or potatoes or those sorts of things. Eating one meal a day, I actually appear to have much more liberty. And so, I sort of eat probably 40% of my calories from carbohydrates, probably 40% from fat, and probably 20% from protein.
Well, I want to take a step back. I didn't know that. Touch on ketosis. What is it, first of all, for people who don't know what it is, why it's important, what works, what doesn't work?
Yeah. I mean, I sort of arrived at it I wouldn't say by accident, but sort of in a stepwise fashion. So going back to that 2009, the first thing I decided to do was I'd started reading literature that suggested that maybe sugar wasn't good for you.
Right.
Beyond just the idea that it's an empty calorie. I mean, I think nobody would dispute that 100 calories of sugar and 100 calories of broccoli have an entirely different nutritional profile. But the conventional wisdom is still that there's no difference in terms of your body's getting fat or not fat as a result of that. Right. But I started to read some stuff that challenged that. And I said, well, okay, I'll just try an experiment. I'll just take sugar out of my diet. Added sugar, right? So sucrose and high fructose corn syrup primarily. And make no other change. So it's not, not restrict carbohydrates or fats or proteins or anything. Just make that one simple change. And interestingly, I mean, at least to me, I fell below 200 for the first time in a long time. And I think I ended up in sort of the mid 190s. And my biomarkers, because of course on the side, I'm really tracking a lot of biomarkers. They're moving in the right direction by a lot. That got me curious. That got me
no added sugar. That's it.
Yeah, just took sugar out of my diet. Well, but I will say this: it's not a trivial endeavor,
right?
Because sugar is so ubiquitous in the U.S. diet that it meant I couldn't eat most forms of bread.
Sure.
So I was only eating very, very specific types of bread that had virtually no sugar in them, which taste like cardboard, by the way.
What?
There's a brand called Ezekiel.
Right, sure.
There's another Julian bread that's at least claims to have no sugar. I've heard people question that claim, and maybe it does have sugar, but it certainly has a lot less sugar than your standard bread that I was eating before that. Switching over to an almond butter that absolutely had no sugar, right? Not using a salad dressing anymore that's got sugar in it. Not using pasta sauce that ingredient 1, tomatoes, ingredient 2, sugar. So once I sort of cleaned that up, I noticed something that, I thought was great. And I thought, okay, well, I want to try this a little bit further. And so, to spare you the long-winded story, basically over the course of a year, I ended up realizing that the more I restricted carbohydrate in my diet, the more my triglycerides reduced, the more my LDL, my HDL cholesterol went up, the more my OGTT went in the right direction, insulin levels got lower. All of these metrics that I cared about were going in the right direction. And so I stood there now down to maybe 100 grams a day of carbohydrate from 600 grams a day, and thought, I wonder, the next step to your question is this thing called nutritional ketosis, which it generally occurs when you reduce your carbohydrate consumption to somewhere in the 30 to 40 grams per day range. And you reduce your protein consumption, again, to somewhere less than 100. Now, I hate talking about sort of definitive numbers because it's highly dependent on the individual, their activity level, and a whole bunch of other features, and where those proteins come from. Are they gluconeogenic or ketogenic proteins? But if you put all that stuff aside, at the first order level, somebody who's eating, say, 30 grams, 40 grams a day of carbohydrate, 100 grams a day of protein, and the remainder fat, is basically tricking their body into thinking they're starving. You mimic a state of starvation, where we evolved this very clever trick, which was our brains, which are entirely glucose dependent, can start to use another type of metabolic fuel called a ketone. And we make those out of fat. And so this trick, basically, all of a sudden your body starts making ketones both out of the fat you're eating and out of the fat within your body. And so, yeah, for me, that was a very positive improvement on all the dimensions that I was tracking.
So is that the best way? The next question I was going to ask is, what's the best way? If someone wants to lose weight, what's the best method? Is it ketosis? Is it just cutting out sugar? Is there one thing, or
there isn't? I wish I could say there was, and I have to admit, I think there was probably a point in my life early on in this endeavor when I really thought that I knew the answer. I can safely say I don't. I mean,
That's good.
I still take care of patients.
Right.
And part of why I do it, I mean, I've said this before and people don't believe me. Part of why I do it is just the constant dose of humility that
Right.
comes from being an idiot and being wrong and being like, okay, I see this person. I think this is what you need to do. We're going to do this. And it doesn't work.
Right.
And you realize, okay, physiology beat me again. And we're going to, in the end, I think what I figured out how to do is get a person there regardless. But I almost never seem to just out of the gate do it. And for what it's worth, it does seem harder in women than it is in men.
Hmm.
And it seems harder in women who are postmenopausal than women
Right.
who are premenopausal. So,
Are there certain universal truths when it comes to nutrition?
yeah, I think there are, right? I mean, I would turn to, and again, I'm a big critic of epidemiology and ecology in general, because I think,
Do you want to explain that to people who
sure,
don't know?
yeah. So epidemiology is the study of, it's basically using data, right?
Mhm.
Historical data, and uh, manipulating the data in such a way that you can tease out associations between one feature and another feature. So even though you may not be familiar with the term, you're certainly familiar with the concept, because every time you open the newspaper, that's what you're basically being
Right.
told, which is, oh, cancer increases the risk of coffee increases the risk of breast cancer, or
Right.
decreases the risk of breast cancer. And those things are never done in experiments. Those things are, we handed out a bunch of surveys to a bunch of women and asked them how much coffee they drank over the past 5 years. And we stratified them into high and low and looked at who got breast cancer high and lo and behold. And so that's really sloppy epidemiology. It
Mhm.
can be done much better than that. And it certainly has helped us in the past, right? So epidemiology is really what gave us the insight into the role of smoking and lung cancer.
Mhm.
We never did an experiment where we took 1 million people and made half of them smoke a bunch of cigarettes and half of them not, and then waited 20 years and who got lung cancer. We've never actually done that experiment, and nor will we ever. But the epidemiology was so strong.
Mhm.
Not to get into the details, but there are these things called hazard ratios, which give you an indication of the difference in risk between those who do behavior X and those who don't, was enormous. But for most things in nutrition, that's not the case. And ecology is sort of again, at the risk of offending epidemiologists, is sort of like the stepchild of epidemiologists, where you basically just go and observe historical cultures and you ask a bunch of questions about them. Now, I think that, and I don't think people would disagree with this, by the way, that when you have an association, the people who live in this part of the world eat this, they are healthy, therefore eating this makes you healthy.
Right.
I think most people with relative common sense realize that's logically incorrect.
Right.
Yet it's still done all the time, unfortunately. But the reverse of that, I think, is quite interesting, which is if you have a whole bunch of cultures
Mhm.
that are doing very different things, but have a Venn diagram that overlaps a few of them, and they all have something in common,
Right.
and none of the others don't have that thing in common. I think then, while you can't infer cause, you have a much greater case to argue that somewhere within that Venn diagram lies an answer. So
what are those things?
yeah, so a guy named Weston Price, who is a dentist,
Sure.
you guys have probably talked about Weston Price, I'm sure. Originally was interested in dentition, ultimately more interested in health, but he basically went around the world and looked for evidence of cultures that didn't have Western disease. And he found many of them, and they were highly diverse in their diets, by the way. So they were at the extreme end of the spectrum. If you looked at, sort of the Maasai, the Inuit, these were cultures that were eating virtually nothing but meat.
Mhm.
At the other end of the spectrum, Catawbans, Okinawa, some of the Swiss, these were cultures that were eating far more vegetables and fruits and carbohydrates and things like that. And yet they had this thing in common, which is they basically didn't have Western disease. And by that, I mean, they didn't have diabetes, they didn't have heart disease, they didn't have cancer. It's almost hard for us to fathom that there could be societies that, until the introduction of Western food, didn't have Western diets, Western diseases. And there were a few things that were common to all of them. Right? And so one of them was they consumed no sugar and refined carbohydrate. And if, the term refined carbohydrate, I think, is we kind of use it a little loosely. I'm not even sure I know what it means, frankly.
Right.
I mean, I have my definition of that.
Well, what's your definition?
My definition is basically a carbohydrate that you're consuming that does not exist in nature.
Got it.
Yeah.
So potatoes not refined.
Right. Potatoes not refined.
Bread
Rice is not refined. Bread is refined.
Yeah.
Fruits not refined. Fruit juice is refined. You know,
Yeah.
that sort of stuff. So if someone hanging out could have eaten this 1,000 years ago, whether it's starch or not, I would say that
Right.
it's hard to make the case that that's the problem.
Close to paleo then.
Yes. Certainly that's the thesis of the
Right.
Paleolithic community, right? Of course, I don't even know what really that means anymore, frankly, because I mean, it's just become like religion. I'm so uninterested in it.
Yeah.
Both religion and diet. When it comes to sort of you're not a real paleo because you eat dairy and you eat this. Like, I'm not sure I know what any of that means. The second feature that was consistent was a relatively low ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acid. So what does that mean? So we have at the highest level, people think about, saturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, monounsaturated fats. That just refers to the chemical structure of them. Monounsaturated fat, everybody typically associates with olive oil, which is a very pure source of that. But monounsaturated fats exist in everything from meat to nuts, etc. Saturated fat we typically associate with animal products, but of course they can exist in plant products as well.
Yep.
So coconut and palm would be actually the purest sources of saturated fat. And of course, meat, depending on the type of meat, can be anywhere from 20% to 50, even 60%. It's pretty rare saturated fat. And then the polyunsaturated fats are just another variant, but we subdivide them into a couple of major categories. Omega-3, which is sea life. So it's basically, seaweed, fish, everything that basically comes out of the ocean. And there's a very clever reason for this that I didn't learn until maybe 5 years ago. Like all through medical school, I never really understood why you could only get these omega-3s in reasonably high doses from marine life. And it has to do with algae being the only organism on Earth that can create a certain chemical bond that's necessary as the precursor. So if you really think about how much comes from algae, it's sort of it creates that lineage, if you will, of omega-3. Omega-6, on the other hand, is primarily driven from vegetable oils. So your canola, safflower, sunflower, all those things. So in the United States today, again, we don't actually know the answer because we don't have really good ways to keep these data. We do it on food availability and waste. But you could estimate that our ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 intake is between 9-1 and 15-1, depending on the source you read. So in other words, we get much more omega-6. Conversely, when you look at the societies that Weston Price examined, these ratios were typically anywhere from 1-1 to 3-1. And if you believe, and I think the data on this are still not entirely clear, but if you believe that the more omega-6 you have relative to omega-3, the more you create a pro-inflammatory environment in your body, that could possibly explain that observation.
So is that as simple as just eating more fish or taking an omega-3 supplement? Or,
well, now you're asking a very specific and understandable question, which is, should we be acting on all of the things Weston Price observed?
Right.
Yeah. So my personal belief is that the less you eat omega-6 and the more you eat omega-3, the better you are. I think for many people, it's probably hard to get to the level of omega-3 without supplementing, especially if you don't have an appetite for the type of fish that are less likely to be contaminated.
Right.
Because it's not like you could say, well, that's great, Peter, because I love sushi.
Great.
Every night.
Right.
It's like, well, that's probably not the way you want to do it.
So wild salmon.
Yeah. Can you eat the type of fish that, for me, it's pretty easy because I love salmon.
Right.
I don't get, as long as I'm cooking it, I love it. If other people are cooking it, I don't like it. But for many people, I think a high quality EPA and DHA supplement.
Yeah.
But with all of these things, I do get a little concerned that it's being done without sort of a level of rigor, right? For example, I wouldn't give a patient EPA and DHA supplements without measuring the concentration of EPA and DHA in the red blood cell, because too much of that stuff is actually harmful.
And so someone wants to eliminate omega-6s. What are the big culprits?
Well, the good news is you can rid yourself of most omega-6 doing the following, right? One is just stop eating things in packages.
Yep.
Because they basically are filled with omega-6.
Yep.
When you consume salad, and that includes salad dressing, don't use a commercial salad dressing. You got to make your own. And making your own isn't rocket science. Because I'm such a simpleton and I don't really have food fatigue. I kind of have the same thing every time I make salad, which is olive oil, fresh lemon, vinegar, and salt. That's it.
Right.
But even if you're one who wants a little bit more variety, figure out ways to make salad dressings without those oils, using olive oil and such.
So olive oil is okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Olive oil is virtually all monounsaturated fat.
Got it.
Um, and again, if you eliminate packaged, if you basically eliminate something that comes in a piece of plastic, you're getting rid of most omega-6.
Are there any natural occurring
Yes,
sources?
omega-6
Yeah.
does occur in nuts and stuff. And so again, it's not like you can't have any omega-6. No, of course not. The
Right.
goal is, how do you, if you're at 10-1 and the bogey is 3-1,
Right.
it's probably a little bit of increasing this and a lot of decreasing this, but this doesn't have to be zero.
Right.
And this can't be infinite. I mean, it's very dangerous.
Right. And so it brings me to my next question, the age of quantified self, whether it's wearables or blood testing markers. Not everyone can get to you or a functional medicine doctor if they want to walk into a doctor locally with their set of, these are the tests
Yeah.
that I want. Like, what is it? We talk about cholesterol, that's debate, LDL, HDL, particle size, does it even matter? What does the average person look for if they're going to really take control of their health and go to a doctor and say, what are the tests that are really meaningful? And I know it's a complicated answer, but
Yeah, it's just sort of funny. I had dinner with a friend last night who basically asked me the same question for his business, right? Which is, he works with basically just CEOs on performance. And his question was, I also want to get a little bit of, biomarker. And he's a physician as well.
Right.
I want to get some biomarker stuff.
Right.
Which ones do you recommend, Peter? And the more we talked about it, the more I realized, are you going to act on the information? Because it's one thing to have all this information. It's one thing to say, here's what your gut biome looks like. Here's what,
Another
blah,
question.
blah, blah, blah,
Right.
blah. Here's what all these
Right.
things look like. If you don't know how to interpret that information, and more importantly, take steps to move it in a direction that you think is the right direction, in some cases, that's easy in that you know what the direction is. So if someone's LDL particle number is here and you believe it should be here, okay, but then the question is, how do you do that?
Right.
If you have their gut biome sequenced, I mean, we can talk about that, I guess, if you want.
Sure.
It's, I think we're in the infancy of that.
Right.
I'm not entirely clear how the distribution of bacteria completely inform my decisions clinically. I think I do this.
You've done any of the tests?
I have, yeah, absolutely. And I there are some patients in which I think it really makes sense, where
Right.
these are patients who have been on antibiotics for sinus infections their entire life,
Right.
and now you're trying to repopulate the flora. That's a different situation than the run-of-the-mill thing. So you look for fungal overgrowth, those sorts of things. Those are kind of like the big and obvious things, but the subtle nuances have escaped me. It might just be that I'm not smart enough, and I'm certainly willing to learn. So back to the biomarker question, what I ended up telling my friend was, look, if I could know just a handful of things about somebody to directionally tell me if the house is on fire, I'd want to know their triglyceride to HDL cholesterol ratio.
Okay.
That's like the poor man's marker for insulin resistance, because the higher that ratio, the worse you are.
Yep.
By comparison, when I started, I was over 5-1. So I had 5 times more triglycerides than HDL cholesterol in milligrams per deciliter. I really like to see patients below 2-1, and if they're trying to make the Olympic team, below 1-1, the Olympic team of health. So that's one thing that's cheap and easy. It costs like $1.72 to figure that out. Something else I would throw in there is, I think it's important to understand the state of inflammation in the body. And I would start, I'm all about, in my patients, like the most nuanced markers, but at the high level, a highly sensitive CRP and homocysteine, maybe a fibrinogen. You get those. Again, all of these are like super cheap. I'm sure. Yeah. I think a fasting insulin is very helpful and infinitely more insightful to me than a fasting glucose. If a fasting glucose is 287, we have a problem, Houston, but we knew that probably before.
Right.
And so you can check the fasting glucose, but to me, the difference between a fasting glucose of 90 and 105, not that interesting.
Right.
The difference between a fasting insulin of 6 and 18, very interesting.
Got it. So we're going to move on to fat. Good, bad.
Sort of like Fox NBC, Fox and MSNBC, right? It's like we live in this world where it's got to be good or it's got to be bad, and there is no in between, right? I don't know. I mean, it's the dose makes the poison, right? And so does the metabolic context. So I mean, I'll say something that sounds really crazy, but especially because I think I've been sort of branded as this low carb guy because
Right.
I eat a low carb diet. I believe that about 2/3 of people end up doing better on a low carbohydrate diet than a standard American diet or even a fat restricted diet. But the reality of it is, if you take an extreme low fat diet, whether it be sort of a, like an explicitly low fat vegan diet or
To
sort
Dean
of
Ornish.
like a Dean Ornish
Right.
diet, and Dean and I are friends, and nothing I'm saying here I wouldn't say right to his face. We've had this discussion 100 times, right? Um, if you ask me the question, does Dean's diet, if you take somebody who's eating a standard American diet and you put them on Dean Ornish's diet, are they going to get better? I would have to say 90% would,
Right.
right? I mean, there's no question in my mind that that's a dramatic improvement. And so you may, not you, but one may look at
Right.
that and say, well, gosh, that person was eating 35% of their calories from fat, and now they're eating, probably with Dean, probably 15, 20%. I don't really know the details of that. Well, obviously taking the fat out of the diet improved them. But of course, the problem with that is that's a shockingly simplistic view of the issue, right? There was 100 things that changed in that dietary shift, right? You eliminated all sugars, you eliminated all refined grains, you eliminated animal products, you reduced fat. If you're familiar with Dean's program, you spent a lot, you introduced meditation, you introduced
Sure.
10 other lifestyle modifications. And so what I think we have to be careful of when we try to answer that question is, let's not confuse the moving pieces, which is, it's very hard to unilaterally make one change and identify the results. And, even though this would, I'm sure, make, Atkins roll over in his grave, the reality of it is Atkins and Ornish had some very common things.
Right.
They both completely eliminated sugars and refined grains. And if you think back to Weston Price's insights, that was the number one common feature amongst all healthy populations. So while certainly Atkins had things that were, unlimited access to protein and fat, and Ornish, of course, would not. And of course, you don't have the animal. But what if the first order effect, the first order benefit comes from that reduction? And by the way, they're both going to be much lower in omega-6 fatty acid as well.
Right.
Not because it's explicitly stated, but it's very hard to eat the types of diets that they're promoting, eating a lot of processed foods.
What about butter? Butter's making a comeback. Grass-fed butter.
Yeah, I mean, look,
Dave.
no, I mean, I don't know him personally, but I'm familiar with his stuff. I think the real question is, was butter bad in the first place? To make a comeback implies I just, like, let's not talk about the data. What are the data that suggest that saturated fat specifically, which was really the big demonized entity in the 1970s? So when the McGovern report, the Senate Select Committee on Health and Human Needs came out in 1977, it was basically the beginning of what I would think was a major turning point. So I mean, if anybody's interested, I have an entire talk on this specific question because I think it's so interesting. It's so interesting to make sure we don't screw this up again, because I think we screwed it up badly in the 1970s and the 1980s. But basically, a lot of really shoddy science went into this notion that fat was bad for you. Logical fallacies, and by the late 1980s, by 1989, when the NIH released its final consensus on the facts around cholesterol, fat was sort of persona non grata, and the low-fat movement began, which, again, I'm not even sure that in and of itself a low-fat movement is inherently bad until you realize that there's a substitution effect that occurs under most circumstances.
Right. And then you can make the argument that that pale or gluten-free is bad if you're substituting with all the same foods. It's just substituting one for the other.
Yeah, and that's sort of my fear, is this idea that, and I'm guilty of it, by the way. So
we all are.
Yeah. But the moment we sort of single out gluten as, I'm sure you saw the hilarious thing on South Park on gluten. Did you ever see this?
Oh, I did not.
That's worth seeing.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. No, that's. I don't watch TV much because I don't have much time. That's worth making time for. So anyway, you've got that whole thing going on, and it's sort of goofy. So this is a question I find very interesting. Right? I think context matters. So to your very specific point about butter, do I drink a bulletproof coffee? Because everybody wants to know. Peter, you must be mainlining those things. The reality of it is I do not, because I'm not in a state of nutritional ketosis. I mean, because I fast so much, I sort of get ketones sort of peaked by the end of the day, but then I sort of take myself out of ketosis with that meal at night and blah, blah, blah. And so the point is my body relies on both glycogen and fat as its fuel. Those are really your two fuel sources. When you're in ketosis, you are basically, your body is purely relying on fat. And I think in that, and if you're, let's say you're someone at the other end of the spectrum who eats like, you know, like I was eating back in 2009, I was basically purely relying on glycogen. And what I actually believe is that back in 2009, any morsel of fat that I consumed was probably not helping me, because it was a currency my body couldn't use, right? Whereas conversely, if you think about what I was doing when I spent, 2 or 3 years in nutritional ketosis, at that point, I could mainline fat. In fact, I did. I had a hard enough time eating enough. And because, I would like eat a whole thing of sour cream in one sitting, like the large thing, just because I needed the fat.
Wow.
And it was like amazing that I was leaner than I am now. I don't know, probably not. But the point is, my body's currency was fat, and therefore that's the fuel I had to give it.
Right.
So it's sort of like, maybe a better analogy is a car. If you're driving a high performance sports car, because if you are, you really ought to be putting in 95 octane. If you're driving a pickup truck, you're probably better off with diesel, assuming you have a diesel engine. Would you use a flex fuel, into a flex fuel car? It's that sort of thing. And so to ask the question, is butter good or bad, is sort of like asking, is 91 octane good or bad? It kind of depends on the engine.
So butter to coffee.
Do I drink coffee or butter into coffee?
We'll take butter out of the coffee. But what's your take on coffee? Good, bad?
I haven't seen
Moderate?
any. I have not seen any evidence that compels me to believe that caffeine is harmful. Again, is it probably a good idea to drink 18 cups of coffee a day? Although I haven't seen evidence telling me that's bad, my intuition tells me that's probably not a good idea. For what it's worth, I used to probably drink 2-3 cups of coffee a day. Interestingly, until I started fasting, and then my appetite for coffee, my taste for it vanished. And so now I drink tea like a banshee. So I'm probably getting the same amount of caffeine, because I love greens, oolongs, black. I'm a tea snob. So I have to have my leaves. I got to steep. I have a stopwatch for steeping it. But for what it's worth, I can't drink coffee anymore. But I really do think that the evidence for coffee and caffeine specifically being beneficial is so, and the evidence for it being harmful is even weaker.
Got it.
So it's not like I would never tell somebody who doesn't drink coffee to start drinking it.
Right.
And if someone's showing up drinking 2 cups a day, I wouldn't tell them to stop.
Right.
Unless, I'm sorry, just to interrupt one thing.
Sure.
There are exceptions to that around the medical side. So somebody who's got atrial fibrillation, there are people where it medically makes sense to remove the caffeine from their diet. Sleep, people with sleep issues and stuff like that. And then looking at when they drink their coffee during the day, but at a macro level, like heart disease, cancer, that sort of thing.
Got it.
Yeah.
In terms of the mind, what can we do from a nutrition standpoint?
Well, I mean, I think
sleep, everything.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think yeah. So this, how many hours you got? I mean, I don't know where to
You get
begin.
the 1-minute answer.
The less your brain is fiddling around dealing with vacillating levels of glucose, the better you are.
Less sugar.
Well, the point is, eat a diet that gives you the most prolonged, steady, sort of steady state level of glucose in your bloodstream and or ketones, if that's the direction you're going. There's only one time of day, paradoxically, I feel not amazing, and it's right after I eat that meal. So if I eat at 7:30 tonight, by 8:30, between 8:30 and 9:30, I'm going to be at my least productive, frankly, least happy, least engaged. That's just not my sweet spot. Now, of course, I'm eating a larger meal than most people would, so I believe that's factoring into it. But I also think that it's sort of disrupting the energy homeostasis. Whereas right now, I haven't eaten in, 20 hours.
Wow.
Feel fantastic, but that's, I think, just because the energy level is pretty stable. And
so what role do you think exercise plays in all of this? Too much, too little?
No, I mean, I think it's just misunderstood. I don't think people understand why to exercise, right? So obviously patients come to me and they say, should I be exercising or not? And the first question is, what are you optimizing for? I mean, if you're optimizing for performance, if someone says, I really want to run a marathon, I may ask them why they want to run a marathon, because I'm not sure that there's, despite the fact that my wife runs marathons all the time, I'm not sure I see the value in it.
Right.
But
Do you tell her that?
yes, no, of course I do. And
I don't
but I'm a hypocrite, right? Because I do those things myself.
Right.
So like, I don't know why you would do that. But the point is, so if there's a performance goal, you have to exercise, right? And you have to exercise in a way that produces a very specific stimulus to mimic the stress of the activity. So if your goal is to run the fastest, Boston Marathon, you got to do what Meb does. But most people, that's not for most people. So if someone says, no, my goal is to live longer and
Right.
to, not suffer metabolic diseases later in life, then I would say exercise does play a role, but it has more to do with two other features. The first is basically preserving the chassis of the car, right?
Mhm.
Sort of like, how do you, especially as we age, about the time we hit 30, all of a sudden the default is not to preserve lean mass, it's to start losing it. So you now have to actively start to do that. And so I am a big proponent of strength training for both men and women for that reason.
Mhm.
But there's another reason that I think most people, certainly escapes most people, which is glucose disposal is very important, right? And glucose disposal means you don't want a whole bunch of glucose just running roughshod around your body. You want it to go in and then get to work. And get to work means either get consumed or get stored as glycogen, but you don't want it hanging around. You don't want it creating, sort of ROS. You don't want it going into fat cells. You don't want it doing all this other stuff. So how do you enhance glucose disposal? There's two ways to do it. One is on the input side, that's the diet, and the other is on the storage side. And the surest way you can increase glucose disposal is basically have muscles, which are the largest sink for glucose, that are willing, able, and ready to dispose of glucose. And so the other reason I think exercise is very important is for this reason, that it enhances your body's ability to dispose of glucose.
So let's say you're at a dinner tonight in New York and someone says, I got 5 minutes, and they're a relatively, young, healthy, happy person. They say, Peter, what do I do? Prescribe me a lifestyle. What are the 3 to 5 things I can do in terms of nutrition, exercise, lifestyle? And you only have a minute with them because they're running off.
Wait, went from 5 to 1.
Yeah, but it's New York. There's
No,
traffic.
okay, wow.
Uber is speeding up instead of slowing down.
Got it. So just to be clear, just to restate the problem statement, he's asking the single most important question of his life, and he's giving me 1 minute to answer it.
Pretty much.
Okay, no, that's good. Yeah, I would just tell him to, ask Oprah or Dr. Oz. I mean, I can't answer that question in a minute. I can't even come close.
5 minutes. But what do you think? What are like the bullets? What are
Look, you've got to. It's okay. The bullets are, there's 8 things that speak. There's 8 behaviors that a human being can sort of adopt that affect their lifespan. And this is just my.
Well, let's hear the
It's nothing to do with reality necessarily. The first is what you eat, and that's a function of what you actually eat, how you eat, and when you eat. So it's everything we've basically been talking about: fasting, not fasting, calorically restricting, not calorically restricting, carbs, fat, all that stuff. So food. And the other thing we sort of alluded to is exercise.
Yep.
But I expand that beyond just what, should I be running or lifting weights or
walking,
CrossFit or walking, exactly. Right. But I also include in that sort of like body work and things that really make a difference for your ongoing longevity, right?
like massage.
Exactly. Like I have a guy that I work with 90 minutes every week, no questions asked, because I just realized my body doesn't recover like it did when I was 22.
Right.
The third one is sleep. And so my really good friend, Kirk Parsley, who's a physician, was a Navy SEAL, then went to med school, then came back and became a doc for the SEALs. And that's what got him really interested in sleep physiology. Is the guy who really turned me on to this 2 years ago, because I trained as a surgeon, and surgeons are macho, and we believe we don't need to sleep, because for 5 years I slept maybe 4 hours a night. And I thought that was totally fine. And, Kirk really helped me understand that that was absolutely not fine. And now I've become obsessed with that literature. And I believe wholeheartedly that one of the lowest hanging pieces of fruit in this entire longevity game is to fix your sleep.
What do you need?
What's that?
What do you need? How much?
Well, I think all available evidence would suggest we need 7.5 to 8.5 hours of sleep a night.
Got it.
But it's not just the duration; it's the quality, right? I mean, you have to be able to get into stage 3 and stage 4. So to take a drug like Ambien and sleep for 8 hours is not actually helpful because you're not achieving the depths of sleep necessary to undergo the hormonal and neuronal benefits of
Got it.
sleep. I actually remember I used to take Ambien on red eyes all the time, and I remember Kirk said to me, he said, "Hey Peter, if someone over there like took a baseball bat to that guy's head and hit him and he was on the ground, would you think he was sleeping?" I said, "Of course not." He goes, Exactly. He's unconscious, but he's not sleeping. Never confuse consciousness with sleep." The fourth component is how we cope with chronic stress. So very quickly, we have these beautiful little adrenal glands sitting on our kidneys. They're kind of divided into 2 compartments, one that copes with acute stress, one that copes with chronic stress. We're really good at coping with acute stress. It's a remarkable adaptation. The chronic stress part doesn't work that well, meaning we didn't really evolve to cope with the sort of things that we all end up now coping with. And so I never really tell my patients, hey, let's eliminate the stress in your life. I don't think that's a
Right.
realistic aspiration. I think what is a realistic aspiration is, can we eliminate the way you cope with it that's
Right.
negative? A plug I would make for a guy who's been very helpful to me is a guy by the name of Bob Roth, who
Sure.
is at the David Lynch Foundation.
Bob.
Yeah, Bob taught me TM, and I think that, not necessarily saying TM is the only form of meditation, the best form of meditation. I just say for me, I tried them all, and it's the one that worked far and away the best. The fifth one is the sense of social support you have and the sense of purpose you have in life. And again, this might not be relevant to a 21-year-old asking this question, but I have a very extreme view of what retirement should look like, and I don't think it's what we at a society level think it should look like, right? I don't think this idea of slog away money in the 401k so that you can stop working at 65 and play golf all day. I'm exaggerating,
Right.
but I'm not actually convinced that that's a way to enhance our longevity. I think we benefit tremendously from a sense of purpose. So we should, I think, shift our thinking around retirement from playing golf all day to no longer working for money, but now working on something that we're just wildly passionate about.
Right.
So having that sense of purpose. The sixth thing is hormonal optimization. How are your hormones optimized? Hormones, there's basically 4 endocrine systems in the body. They kind of run the show. And as we age, that's one of the greatest, most obvious deteriorations, right? Everyone says getting older means getting slower, getting fatter, getting more tired, getting colder, all of these things, having less energy. Those things are regulated by our hormones, and we can optimize those things. The seventh thing is pharmacotherapy. I think, again, if there's a topic like fat where everyone just assumes it's good or bad, it's drugs. But the reality of it is, that's sort of like saying, are hammers good or bad? Sort of like, well, it depends. If you have a nail and it has to go into a piece of wood, a hammer is very good. If you have a Phillips screw and it has to go into that wall, the hammer's not so helpful. And similarly, every drug actually should be treated that way, right? Is a statin good or bad? Entirely depends.
Right.
And then the eighth component, which sounds obvious, but you'd be amazed at how many people avoid it, is your ability to avoid doing stupid things. And again, so I'll give you examples of stupid things. And I wouldn't ask for a show of hands, but I don't know, how many people text and drive?
Right.
How many people drive after they've had 2 drinks? They're not drunk, but they've had 2 drinks. I would actually put smoking in that category today.
Yeah.
I mean, I think today to smoke is just completely illogical.
Right.
And so if you actually can eliminate all of the stupid behaviors in your life, I mean, I'll give you another stupid behavior, which I just committed 2 days ago. It was like, I don't know why I was doing this. I'm walking down Fifth. I'm late to a meeting. The light's red. I decide to go for it. Yeah, I dodged a bullet. Well, what the hell was I doing that for?
Right.
Like, what in the hell was so important that I had to risk getting hit by a car for? But those things add up. And so when you eliminate all the stupid behaviors in your life, I'm convinced you're getting a 5% risk reduction in mortality. So in my 5 minutes, that's what I basically say. Now, of course, I've said nothing because I've just given you the categories. I can't even begin to get into how do you optimize those 8 things to enhance your lifespan, except for 8. 8's so obvious. Just stop doing stupid stuff.
We'll bring you back for that another time. Thank you so much for coming.